The room was already warm when Eleanor stepped inside, heat rising from bodies packed too closely into a space that pretended to be grand. Chandeliers hummed faintly above her, their light caught in polished wood and old glass, a softness that tried to make the evening feel generous. She paused just long enough for the weight of the place to register in her chest. Too many memories pressed into too few walls, then moved again, because standing still had always been dangerous here. She felt the town before she saw it, the familiar narrowing of breath, the subtle tightening at the base of her skull. Northumberland had a way of reclaiming her body before her mind could intervene. It was there in the smell of salt clinging to coats hung by the door, in the way voices curved around one another with practiced politeness. Everyone knew how to speak without saying anything. Eleanor had learned that skill early. She had learned how to disappear in plain sight. She accepted a glass of wine she didn't want, fingers brushing the stem, already cataloging faces. Old classmates now softened by age, their sharpness worn down into something manageable. Professors who had once looked through her as if she were a draft instead of a finished thought. A few people who recognized her and smiled with a careful delight reserved for success stories that had left and returned, if only briefly. She stayed near the edge of the room, watched reflections ripple across the tall windows. Outside, the sea was invisible, but she could feel it. The constant pressure of it against the cliffs. The way it never stopped insisting. It was then, unannounced, uninvited, that something shifted. Eleanor didn't see her immediately. She felt the interruption first. A pause in the rhythm of her scanning, like a skipped breath. Her attention snagged on a quiet absence of sound, a pocket of stillness that didn't belong to her. She turned, almost reluctantly, as if aware that whatever waited there would rearrange something she had worked hard to keep intact. Isla Crow stood a few steps away, speaking with an older woman Eleanor didn't recognize. She wasn't dressed for attention. Nothing about her asked for it. A simple dark dress, sleeves pushed back slightly, hands expressive but restrained. Her hair was pinned loosely, already threatening to escape. She laughed once, soft, surprised, and the sound landed somewhere just behind Eleanor's sternum, as if it had always been meant to. Recognition arrived without explanation. Not desire. Not yet. Something quieter and more unsettling. The sense of seeing a shape you've been carrying internally suddenly rendered in flesh and breath. Isla turned, and their eyes met for a fraction of a second too long to be accidental. Eleanor felt the moment stretch, thin as glass. Isla's expression didn't change much, just a slight narrowing of focus, an almost imperceptible stilling, as if she too had felt the interruption. Then it passed. Isla looked away. The room resumed its noise. Eleanor exhaled and realized she had been holding her breath. She told herself it was nothing. Trick of nostalgia, perhaps. Old buildings had a way of creating ghosts. She took a sip of wine, tasted oak and something bitter underneath, and moved toward the far side of the room where conversation thinned. The evening required patience, observation. She reminded herself why she was there, why she had come back at all. She recited the facts silently, like a protective charm. Maisie Turner, 20 years old. Last seen near the harbor, a town that closed ranks when asked to remember. She was aware of Isla again before they spoke. They change in air when someone steps too close. Eleanor turned just as Isla was excusing herself from the woman beside her, stepping slightly aside to make room for a group passing through. Their shoulders nearly brushed. Isla stopped. "I'm sorry," she said, voice low, precise. "I didn't see you." "It's all right," Eleanor replied, equally quiet. She was suddenly conscious of her accent, the softened edges she'd picked up elsewhere. Isla noticed it too. Eleanor saw the curiosity flicker, quick and contained. "You're new," Isla said, not a question. "Just visiting," Eleanor answered. It was the truth, arranged carefully. Isla smiled, something small and genuine. "I thought I knew everyone who still came to these things." "People change," Eleanor said, then wondered why she'd chosen that particular phrase. "Yes," Isla agreed. There was a pause, not awkward exactly, but attentive. Isla glanced toward the crowd, then back. "Is it too loud in here for you, or am I imagining it?" Eleanor felt the smallest release at the acknowledgement. "It's a lot. There's a courtyard," Isla said. "If you need air." I might, Eleanor replied. She didn't move. Neither did Isla. The moment dissolved when someone called Isla's name. She turned, apology already forming, then hesitated. I'm Isla, she said, as if that were something Eleanor might need. Eleanor, she answered, and the name felt heavier than usual as it left her mouth. Isla nodded once, committing it to memory, then was gone, drawn back into the social machinery of the room. Eleanor stayed where she was, pulse uneven, trying to understand the precise nature of the fracture she felt opening beneath her ribs. She found herself watching Isla without meaning to. The way she listened more than she spoke. The way she angled her body protectively toward the elderly woman she returned to, hand settling briefly at her back. Care, Eleanor thought. Not performative. Lived in. She forced herself to look away. Later, she slipped out to the courtyard alone. The night air was cool, damp with salt. Stone walls held the day's chill. She leaned against the balustrade and closed her eyes, letting the wind press against her face. The town murmured behind her, laughter and music softened by distance. She told herself she was grounding, recalibrating. That this was part of the work. She told herself many things. Time moved without asking permission. When Isla joined her, she didn't announce herself. Eleanor sensed her presence in the shift of temperature, the way the air seemed to rearrange itself. Isla stood at the railing, a careful distance away. Better? Isla asked. Yes, Eleanor said. Thank you. They stood in silence. Not the strained kind. The kind that invited thought to wander and return altered. Eleanor became aware of the sound of the sea below, unseen but insistent. Of Isla's breathing, steady and unhurried. You grew up here? Isla asked eventually. Eleanor nodded. A long time ago. And you left, yes. Isla considered this. Most people don't come back. I didn't plan to stay, Eleanor said too quickly. Isla's mouth curved slightly, as if she understood something Eleanor hadn't said aloud. No one ever does. A door opened behind them. Voices spilled into the courtyard, then faded as the door closed again. Life continuing, indifferent to the small alignment occurring at the edge of its awareness. Eleanor felt her body respond before her mind could intervene. A subtle warmth, a tightening that had nothing to do with the cold. She glanced at Isla's hands resting on the stone. Pale, steady, capable. She imagined, unbidden, what those hands might have restored, coaxed back into wholeness. That startled her. She pulled back internally, chastising herself. This was not part of the plan. Isla shifted her weight, the movement slight but enough to change the space between them. Eleanor felt it like a question. I should go back in, Eleanor said, though she didn't move. Isla nodded. Of course. Neither of them turned immediately. When they finally did, the distance between them seemed larger than before, charged with something unnamed. Eleanor carried it with her as she re-entered the noise, the feeling settling and resettling, refusing to be dismissed. Recognition, she thought again, as if repeating it might make it less dangerous. It didn't. Eleanor began returning to the cafe before she admitted to herself that it had become a habit. The place sat just off the main road, tucked between a bookshop that smelled of damp paper and a florist that never seemed to close. Inside, the windows fogged easily, blurring the harbor into a smear of gray and motion. It was quiet enough to think, public enough to disappear. She told herself that was why she chose it. She unfolded her laptop, ordered coffee she barely tasted, and let the low murmur of conversation move around her without asking anything of her in return. On the third morning, Isla appeared as if she had always belonged to that corner of Eleanor's day. She didn't approach right away. She stood near the counter, speaking softly with the barista, scarf loose at her throat, hair half wild from the wind. Eleanor felt the familiar interruption before she looked up. Her fingers paused on the keyboard. The screen went unread. Isla noticed her almost at the same time. Their eyes met. There was no surprise this time, only a brief, mutual assessment, as if both were silently confirming what had already been established. Isla smiled and carried her cup over, stopping just short of Eleanor's table. "May I?" she asked, gesturing to the empty chair. Eleanor hesitated for a fraction of a second that felt much longer inside her chest. Then she nodded. Of course. They sat with their coffee between them, steam rising, the table marked with old rings from countless other cups. Outside, a gull cried and the sound slid in through the glass, thin and sharp. I didn't realize this place had Wi-Fi, Isla said. It's unreliable, Eleanor replied. But persistent. Isla laughed quietly. That sounds like half the town. They fell into an easy rhythm after that. Not confessional, not guarded, something in between. Isla asked what Eleanor was working on. Eleanor answered with the careful vagueness she had perfected. Research. Consulting. Isla didn't push. Instead, she spoke about a restoration project she'd been struggling with, a painting from a private collection whose colors refused to behave. She described the patience it required, the way you had to learn when to stop touching something and let it settle. Eleanor listened, attentive in a way that surprised her. She found herself imagining Isla's hands steadying old canvases, coaxing truth back to the surface without forcing it. The thought stayed with her longer than it should have. When Isla stood to leave, she hesitated. I walk by the cliffs most mornings, she said, as if it were an afterthought. If you ever want company. Eleanor nodded again, too aware of how quickly the answer came. Maybe. Isla smiled. Maybe then. After she left, Eleanor stared at her screen, the words swimming uselessly. She closed the laptop and sat with the quiet hum of the cafe, with the warmth left behind by Isla's presence. She told herself she was reading the town through its people. That proximity had its uses. The rationalizations arrived easily. They always did. They walked together 3 days later. The path along the cliffs was narrow, hemmed in by grass that bent perpetually toward the sea. Wind tugged at their coats, threaded salt into every breath. They didn't walk close enough to touch, but Eleanor was aware of Isla at her side, the way her pace adjusted without comment, how she waited when Eleanor stopped to look out over the water. The sea below was restless, gray folding into darker gray, white foam flashing like teeth. Eleanor felt something inside her settle into a familiar vigilance. The edge had always sharpened her. She had learned early how to stand where one misstep could be fatal and not let it show. You always walk like you're measuring the ground, Isla said gently. Eleanor glanced at her. Is that a problem? No, Isla replied. Interesting. They stopped where the path widened, where an old bench faced the water. Isla brushed dirt from the seat, before sitting, the gesture unthinking, habitual. Eleanor sat beside her, a careful distance between them. I used to come here when I was younger, Isla said. When I needed to think. Did it help? Sometimes, Isla answered. Sometimes it just made the questions louder. Eleanor felt the truth of that settle into her bones. She watched the waves crash and pull back, over and over, relentless. She thought of Maisie Turner, of a young woman swallowed by a place that pretended to protect its own. The case files replayed themselves behind her eyes, facts looping without resolution. She had learned to live inside that uncertainty. What unsettled her was the way Isla's presence softened its edges. They walked on, the conversation drifting. Isla spoke of her mother, of the slow erosion of illness, the way days narrowed around care. Eleanor listened, offered nothing of herself beyond attentive silence. It felt safer that way. Still, Isla seemed to sense the shape of what Eleanor didn't say. You don't talk much about your life elsewhere, Isla observed, not accusatory. Curious. There isn't much to tell, Eleanor replied. Isla didn't contradict her. She only nodded, as if storing the response away for later consideration. They parted at the edge of town, a brief pause where neither seemed in a hurry to leave. Isla reached out, then stopped herself, fingers hovering near Eleanor's sleeve before falling back to her side. The restraint was louder than any touch. Tomorrow, Isla said. Not a question. Tomorrow? Eleanor agreed. The investigation moved forward in fragments. Eleanor spent her afternoons in archives that smelled of dust and old glue, scanning records that stopped just short of saying anything useful. She spoke to people who remembered Maisie in half-formed anecdotes, who spoke of her brightness, her trouble, her tendency to wander. Names surfaced and sank again. Sebastian Crow's appeared with the regularity of a tide, always receding before it could be grasped. At night, Eleanor lay awake in her rented flat, listening to pipes groan, replaying the day's conversations. Isla's voice threaded itself through her thoughts, uninvited. She imagined telling her the truth, then imagined the silence that would follow. She imagined walking away, leaving this town to its careful forgetting. Neither vision brought relief. Isla began to appear in other corners of Eleanor's life. At the market, selecting apples with unnecessary deliberation. At the harbor, standing with a group of volunteers cleaning debris from the rocks after a storm. Each encounter felt accidental, plausible. Eleanor wondered how much of that plausibility Isla herself believed. They spoke more easily now. About books. About the strangeness of returning to places that insist on knowing you. About the way names can weigh differently depending on who speaks them. Isla asked questions that skirted the edges of Eleanor's defenses, never pushing hard enough to cause retreat. One afternoon, as they walked through the narrow streets near the old quay, Isla stopped suddenly, reaching out to steady Eleanor as a cyclist sped past too close. Her hand closed around Eleanor's wrist, warm, firm. The contact lasted only a second, but Eleanor felt it echo through her body, a low reverberation that had nothing to do with surprise. "I'm sorry," Isla said, releasing her immediately. "It's fine," Eleanor replied, though her pulse took longer to slow. They resumed walking, a new awareness settling between them. Eleanor became acutely conscious of distance, how easily it could be crossed, how deliberately it was maintained. She told herself again that this was a complication she did not need. She told herself many things. In the evenings, they sometimes sat together at Isla's kitchen table, cups of tea cooling untouched as conversation stretched and folded. Isla's house carried the quiet weight of long habitation. Old photographs lined the walls. Eleanor noted Sebastian's presence among them, smiling, immaculate. She kept her reactions carefully neutral. "You don't like him," Isla said once, not looking at her. Eleanor stilled. "Why would you think that? You change," Isla replied. "Just slightly?" Eleanor chose her words with care. "I don't know him, that's true," Isla said. "Neither do I. Not really." The admission hung between them, fragile. Eleanor felt the urge to reach across the table, to offer reassurance she wasn't sure she could justify. She didn't move. Later, walking home alone, Eleanor replayed the moment again and again. Isla's quiet honesty. The trust implied by it. The danger threaded through both. She knew then that the line she had drawn was no longer where she had left it. That night, the wind battered her windows harder than usual. Eleanor lay awake, one hand resting on her stomach, breathing shallowly, as if listening for something that might announce itself. Recognition returned, persistent and unwelcome, settling deeper with each repetition. She did not know yet what it would demand of her. The invitation came without ceremony. Isla mentioned dinner as they stood at the edge of the harbor, watching the tide retreat and leave the boats leaning into their ropes like tired animals. She spoke as if it were an ordinary thing, an extension of the evenings they had already been sharing. "My brother is hosting," she said. Nothing formal, just food. Eleanor felt the shift immediately. Not fear. Alignment. Pieces sliding into a configuration she had been anticipating without admitting it. The name settled heavily between them, altering the air. "I don't want to intrude," Eleanor said, already aware that the decision had been made somewhere deeper than language. Isla turned toward her. "You wouldn't." They walked the rest of the way in silence, the path narrowing, the sea darkening as clouds rolled in from the horizon. Eleanor catalogued the feeling as she always did. Tightness beneath the ribs. A sharpening of focus. The subtle hum that told her she was standing too close to something consequential. That evening she dressed with deliberate care. Nothing that invited attention. Nothing that suggested retreat. The mirror reflected a woman she had learned to inhabit, contained, composed, built from choices rather than accident. Still, as she fastened her coat, she felt the fault line beneath that composure begin to vibrate. The Crow House rose from the street, with the quiet authority of money that didn't need to announce itself. Stone cleaned and repaired over generations. Windows glowing softly. Eleanor paused before knocking, the town's memory pressing in from all sides, then lifted her hand. Sebastian Crow opened the door himself. He was taller than Eleanor expected. His smile arrived quickly, polished and warm, practiced without feeling false. His eyes lingered just long enough to register her fully, the way one professional appraises another without appearing to do so. "You must be Eleanor," he said. "Isla's mentioned you." The phrasing was careful. Eleanor noted it. "Only good things, I hope," Eleanor replied, returning his smile with equal precision. "Of course," Sebastian said. "Please, come in." The house smelled of herbs and roasted meat, of something sweet cooling on a counter. Isla appeared from the kitchen, sleeves rolled, a faint flush in her cheeks. Her expression shifted when she saw Eleanor, not surprise but relief quickly contained. "I'm glad you came," Isla said softly. Eleanor nodded. "Thank you for inviting me." Dinner unfolded with a studied ease. Sebastian spoke fluently, drawing Eleanor into conversation with questions that felt generous rather than probing. He spoke of the town's recent developments, of preservation projects, of philanthropy framed as civic duty. Eleanor listened, attentive, filing away tone and cadence. He never mentioned Maisie Turner. Neither did Isla. Under the table, Isley brushed Eleanor's once. Then again. The contact was light, plausible. Eleanor's breath caught despite herself. She didn't pull away. Isla's hand rested briefly against Eleanor's thigh, a question formed entirely of restraint. Eleanor answered by staying still. The moment passed. The damage did not. After dinner, Sebastian excused himself to take a call, leaving them alone in the sitting room. Rain began tapping against the windows, tentative at first, then steadier, the sound wrapping the house in a private rhythm. Isla moved to clear the table. Eleanor followed without thinking, handing her plates, their fingers touching more often than necessary. The kitchen felt smaller than before, the air thick with warmth and unspoken awareness. "You don't have to help," Isla said. "I want to," Eleanor replied. They stood side by side at the sink, shoulders nearly touching. Isla washed. Eleanor dried. The routine felt intimate in its ordinariness. Life continuing, as if nothing were about to fracture. "I feel like I know you," Isla said suddenly. Eleanor's hands stilled. "You don't," she said gently. Too gently. Isla turned to face her. "It's not what I mean." The rain intensified, drumming harder against the glass. Eleanor became acutely aware of the space between them, how easily it could disappear. She thought of the files locked away in her bag, of photographs she hadn't yet allowed herself to examine closely, of the line she had crossed simply by standing there. "This is complicated," Eleanor said. Isla smiled, something sad and knowing in it. "Everything is." They didn't speak again until they were outside, coats pulled tight against the rain. Sebastian had retreated upstairs, the house settling into its nighttime quiet. The street was empty, slick with water reflecting the glow of distant lamps. Eleanor should have left. She knew that. The knowledge sat clearly in her mind, precise and undeniable. She stayed. They stood beneath the awning, rain misting the air between them. Isla's breath was visible now, shallow and quick. Eleanor felt the pull toward her like gravity, inexorable. "I should go," Eleanor said, the words an echo rather than an intention. Isla nodded once. "I know." Neither moved. When Isla leaned in, it was slow, deliberate. Enough time for Eleanor to stop it. Enough space for refusal. Eleanor closed the distance instead, her hand lifting to rest at Isla's elbow, light and questioning. Isla answered by stepping closer, her body aligning with Eleanor's in a way that felt inevitable only in retrospect. The kiss was brief, soft, more an acknowledgement than an act. Lips meeting and parting, breath shared and then reclaimed. It sent a shock through Eleanor's system that had nothing to do with surprise. It felt like recognition completing a circuit. They separated almost immediately. Isla's eyes were dark, searching Eleanor's face for something she wasn't sure she wanted to find. Eleanor felt unmoored, her internal compass spinning uselessly. "This changes things," Isla said quietly. "Yes," Eleanor replied. They stood there, rain soaking into their coats, the kiss replaying itself again and again in Eleanor's body. She felt the weight of it settle, irreversible. Later, alone in her flat, Eleanor opened the folder she had been avoiding. Photographs glowed on the screen, stark and undeniable. Sebastian Crowe entering a private club in London. Faces blurred around him. Transactions implied rather than shown. One image stopped her breath. Isla in the background, laughing with someone just out of frame. Unaware. Innocent. Present. Eleanor closed her eyes, the taste of Isla's mouth still lingering, the rain still echoing in her ears. The fracture widened, splitting intention from desire, duty from something far more dangerous. She knew then that whatever came next would cost her more than she had planned to pay. The days after the kiss did not announce themselves as different. They arrived quietly, layered over what already existed, changing the weight of familiar moments rather than their shape. Eleanor still walked the same streets, still ordered the same coffee, still carried the investigation forward with the discipline that had shaped her adult life. But everything felt fractionally off-center, as if the town itself had tilted without telling her. She did not see Isla for 2 days. Not by accident. Not by coincidence. By choice made through inaction. Eleanor told herself it was necessary. That space was the only way to regain clarity. She spent those days buried in records, following threads that grew darker the longer she held them. Financial movements masked as charitable foundations. Properties purchased through intermediaries. Names that reappeared under different spellings, different companies. Sebastian Crowe's presence threaded through all of it with elegant precision. What unsettled her was not the evidence. It was how often Isla appeared in the margins. Photographs. Guest lists. Renovation permits signed on her recommendation. Innocuous. Peripheral. But constant. Always near the surface of her brother's world without ever touching its core. Eleanor began to understand the architecture of Sebastian's protection, not walls, but proximity. He hid behind what he loved. The thought lodged painfully in her chest. On the 3rd evening, Isla came to Eleanor's door. There was no knock at first. Just the quiet awareness of someone standing on the other side. Eleanor sensed it the way she had sensed her before, through a subtle rearranging of the air. She opened the door without fully deciding to. Isla stood there, coat damp from mist, hair undone by the wind. Her face was composed, but something in her eyes had hardened into resolve. "You disappeared," Isla said. Eleanor stepped aside. "I needed time." Isla entered without waiting to be asked. She stood in the narrow hall, taking in the space with careful attention, as if memorizing it. The door closed behind her with a soft, final sound. "Did I do something wrong?" Isla asked. "No," Eleanor said immediately. Too immediately. Isla studied her, the silence between them stretching thin. "Then tell me what I did." Eleanor inhaled slowly, feeling the familiar pressure rise. She chose her words with the same care she used to handle fragile evidence. "You didn't do anything. I'm not good at this." "At what?" Isla asked. "At letting things happen," Eleanor replied. Isla's expression softened, then tightened again. It already happened. They stood there, the memory of the kiss moving between them like a current neither could ignore. Eleanor felt it in her body, a warmth that had nowhere to go, a pull she refused to name out loud. "I don't want to be a mistake," Isla said quietly. "You're not," Eleanor answered. "But I might be," Isla pressed. "To you." Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, Isla was closer. Not touching. Close enough to make the absence of contact felt. "I don't know how to do this without hurting you," Eleanor said. Isla nodded once. "Then don't pretend it won't." The word settled heavily. Isla moved past Eleanor into the small living room, shedding her coat, perching on the edge of the sofa. She looked suddenly tired, the weight of care and loyalty etched into her posture. "I keep thinking about that night," Isla said. "About how it felt simple for a moment." "It wasn't," Eleanor replied. "No," Isla agreed. "But it was honest." The truth of that struck harder than Eleanor expected. She sat opposite Isla, leaving deliberate space between them. Her hands rested flat on her knees, grounding herself in the physicality of the moment. "I didn't lie to you about how that felt," Eleanor said. "I'm lying by not telling you why it can't continue." Isla's gaze sharpened. "Why?" Eleanor hesitated. The line pressed against her throat, hot and dangerous. She thought of the photographs again, of the way Isla had laughed, unknowing, of the cost of telling her the truth before it was time. "Because there are things happening here that you don't see yet," Eleanor said carefully. "And I can't let you be pulled into them." Isla stood abruptly. "You don't get to decide that for me." "I know," Eleanor said. "That's the problem." They stared at one another, the room holding its breath. Outside, a car passed, tires hissing against wet pavement. Life continuing, indifferent. "Is this about my brother?" Ayla asked. The question landed precisely where Eleanor least wanted it to. Eleanor did not answer immediately. That silence was enough. Isla's face changed, not shock, but recognition reshaping itself into something colder. "You think he's involved in something?" "I know he is," Eleanor said. The words once spoken could not be retrieved. Isla laughed softly, disbelieving. "In what? Corruption? Shady investments? This town runs on that." Eleanor shook her head. "Not that." The space between them felt suddenly immense. Isla crossed her arms, a defensive gesture that cut Eleanor more deeply than anger would have. "Say it," Isla said. Eleanor didn't. She couldn't. "Not yet." "Then don't look at me like that," Isla continued. "Like you're already mourning something." "I'm trying to protect you," Eleanor said. Isla's voice hardened. "From him or from you?" The question struck its mark. Eleanor felt the ground shift beneath her feet. She stood slowly, aware that every movement now carried consequence. "I should go," Isla said, "before this becomes something I can't forgive." Eleanor wanted to stop her. The impulse surged violently, uncontained. She pictured reaching out, fingers closing around Isla's wrist again, the way they had on the street. She did nothing. Isla paused at the door, hand resting on the handle. She did not turn around. "You don't get to keep choosing silence," Isla said. "Not if you want me to stay." Then she left. The next days unfolded with merciless precision. Eleanor's car was vandalized overnight. Tires slashed cleanly, methodically. No message left behind. The warning lay in the restraint. She reported it through official channels, received acknowledgments devoid of comfort. Her cover thinned. A man she did not recognize watched her from across the street one afternoon, gaze too steady to be accidental. A call came late one night. No voice, just breath. Then a click. She moved through the town with heightened awareness, every sound catalogued, every shadow noted. The investigation accelerated, pieces locking into place with brutal clarity. Sebastian was not careless. He was thorough. Which meant someone had noticed her. Isla stopped answering messages. Eleanor saw her once across the harbor, speaking with Sebastian. The siblings stood close, their heads inclined toward one another. Eleanor watched Isla's face carefully, searching for signs of knowledge, of fracture. She saw none. The absence felt like loss. That night, Eleanor reviewed the final pieces alone, the room lit only by her laptop's glow. The evidence was complete now, the shape of the operation undeniable. She should have felt satisfaction. Instead, she felt hollow. A message arrived just before midnight. "Unknown number. She won't thank you for this." Eleanor stared at the screen till the words blurred. She knew then that the danger had shifted. That Isla was no longer simply adjacent to the investigation. She was leverage. The next move would require a choice Eleanor had been delaying since the moment she returned. She closed the laptop and sat in the dark, breathing shallowly, listening to the building settle around her. For the first time she did not know which truth would cost less. Eleanor did not sleep. She sat on the floor with her back against the sofa, knees drawn up, the room lit only by the thin line of streetlight slipping through the curtains. Her phone lay face down beside her, silent, heavier than any object had a right to be. Every option she had spent years mastering felt suddenly inadequate. There was no clean extraction here, no version of the truth that spared what she had come to care for. She thought of Maisie Turner alive somewhere, waiting without knowing it. Thought of Isla, still walking through days shaped by loyalty and habit, unaware of how close the ground beneath her had come to giving way. Thought of herself at 18, leaving this town with a certainty that escape was the same as freedom. It had taken her 12 years to understand the difference. Morning arrived without permission. The operation was set for just before dawn. Quiet. Contained. The kind of work that never made headlines because it relied on cooperation that would later be denied. Eleanor dressed slowly, deliberately, as if inhabiting each movement might steady her. She left the flat without looking back, locking the door behind her with a click that sounded final. The arrest happened in stages she would later struggle to remember in sequence. Sebastian Crowe did not resist. He smiled once, faintly, when Eleanor stepped into view. Not surprise. Recognition. "You should have stayed gone," he said, voice low enough that only she could hear. Eleanor did not respond. She watched his hands instead, the way they curled and uncurled, restless despite his composure. She wondered, briefly, if Isla would ever be able to reconcile this man with the brother she had loved. Maisie Turner was found an hour later. Alive. Thin. Wrapped in a blanket that smelled of damp stone and old fear. When Eleanor saw her lifted into the waiting vehicle, something inside her chest cracked open, not relief exactly, but the sudden absence of a weight she had been carrying since the moment she stepped back into Northumberland. The victory arrived without ceremony. It did not feel like triumph. It felt like survival. By mid-morning, Eleanor's cover was gone. Not exposed publicly, nothing so dramatic. But erased quietly, efficiently. Her superiors spoke in careful tones about operational risk, about unavoidable consequences. Her flat was no longer safe. Her position no longer viable. The life she had constructed elsewhere folded in on itself with astonishing speed. She stood on the cliff path by late afternoon, the wind pressing hard against her coat, the sea restless below. Northumberland stretched behind her, unchanged on the surface, already closing over the wound. She had one choice left. Isla answered the door herself. Her face looked different. Not older. Sharper. As if something essential had been removed and replaced with resolve. Eleanor stood on the step, suddenly unsure of how to occupy her own body. "I won't come in if you don't want me to," Eleanor said. Isla held her gaze for a long moment. Then she stepped aside. The house felt quieter than Eleanor remembered. Heavier. The photographs still lined the walls, but Sebastian's presence had shifted from benign familiarity to something unsettled, unresolved. They stood facing one another in the sitting room, distance maintained by instinct rather than fear. "You were right," Isla said. "About him." Eleanor nodded once. She did not say anything else. "I confronted him," Isla continued. "Not because of you, because I couldn't not know anymore." The phrasing mattered. Eleanor absorbed it carefully. "He didn't deny everything," Isla said. "Just enough." Eleanor felt the familiar ache behind her eyes. "I'm sorry, I know," Isla replied. "That's what makes it worse." Silence stretched between them. Not brittle. Weighted. "I lost my job," Eleanor said finally. "I lost everything that came before this." Isla watched her closely. "And what did you get?" Eleanor hesitated. Honesty pressed insistently at her throat. "The truth," she said. "And the knowledge that I can't walk away from it anymore." Isla's breath caught softly. She crossed the room, stopping just short of Eleanor. Close enough that Eleanor could feel the warmth of her, the familiar steadiness. "Neither can I," Isla said. They stood like that for a long time, the aftermath settling around them. No dramatic gestures. No declarations. Just presence, deliberate and unguarded. Later, they packed in silence. Not everything. Only what could be carried without regret. Isla moved through the house with practiced care, selecting objects that held meaning rather than history. Eleanor watched, occasionally offering help, more often absorbing the quiet intimacy of shared purpose. At the door, Isla paused, keys in hand. "We don't know where this goes," she said. "I know," Eleanor replied. "And you're not promising safety, no. Or ease, no." Isla nodded. "Good." They left Northumberland as evening settled, the town receding in the mirrors until it was only a suggestion of stone and memory. The road curved inland, away from the sea's constant insistence. Eleanor felt the familiar pull of disappearance rise within her and let it go. She reached for Isla's hand. Isla took it without hesitation. They drove on, the future unshaped, the silence between them no longer a barrier but a shared language. Some truths don't arrive as answers, only as places you can no longer leave. Would you have chosen comfort over truth, or would you have stayed, knowing exactly what it would cost? Some stories don't end when the moment fades. They stay with us, asking to be felt. If this story awakened something you recognize, you're welcome to share your truth in the comments. And if this journey stayed with you, consider subscribing to Secret Garden Stories and sharing it with someone who might feel seen. Your support helps this space grow. A world with more love, more honesty, and less silence. Thank you for being here.